All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to session 2 of our seminar on training for teaching and preaching. In this session, I want to share with you some thoughts about how to get started in your preparation. Not only how to get started, but how to quickly get focused and to try to bring some focus to what you're going to present. As chapter 2 of the reading from Haddon Robinson's book explains, getting focused is very important. And so that's something that we want to aim for from the very beginning. So I want to share some thoughts with you first about whether you're preparing a lesson from scratch. And then, second, talk about maybe if you're preparing a lesson using a curriculum, or maybe you're teaching through some kind of curriculum where a lot of information is supplied for you. Okay, so I'll offer some thoughts for either one of those settings. First, focusing on if you're creating a lesson from scratch. So maybe you are given an opportunity to teach in a setting and you're not given any particular curriculum to use, or you're not asked to use any particular curriculum, and you really have the opportunity to craft your own lesson from scratch. Now, some of us really like that opportunity. Some of us even almost prefer that opportunity. Others of us do not. We would much rather be given a curriculum to follow or something like that. But let's think first about a setting where you have the opportunity to craft a lesson from scratch. Now, you may start out with a certain passage in mind that you'd like to teach from, or you might start out with a certain topic or subject in mind that you'd like to cover. Either way, what I'd like to encourage you to do is to quickly find a focus passage and then camp out there. Just camp out there for the extent of your teaching. Now, I don't mean you can't bring in other verses or passages as it might be appropriate, but you want to have one passage that you're going to focus on. There are several reasons for that we'll kind of touch on through here, but if nothing else, that at least helps your students remember what passage you talked about later on, or at least it gives them a better shot at remembering the passage you talked about. So later on, maybe they're thinking about some point you made that they want to ponder a little bit more, and they're trying to think, well, wow, where did that come from? What passage were we studying? Well, if you focused on one main passage, they'll have a much easier time, hopefully, recalling what passage you were studying. It's much easier than if you were hopping around all over the place. So that's a nice gift to give to your students. Give them the opportunity for things to be a little bit more memorable. Now, let's say you're preparing a lesson from scratch and you start your preparations with a passage in mind. Maybe it's your favorite passage. You decide to go with your favorite passage, or maybe you're teaching through a series of sorts, and the next passage you're going to teach on just comes up very naturally. That's usually the case for me when I'm preaching, and I preach through a book of the Bible. I'm going to start my preparation with a certain passage in mind. It's going to be the next passage that comes up in the book. But let's say you start with a passage in mind. What I would encourage you to do then is focus on that passage and then only bring in other verses sparingly. Okay? Try not to hop around a lot. I'm going to give you a few reasons for that in just a moment. But for now, just let me give you that thought and that encouragement. Use other passages sparingly. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to that general rule. For example, sometimes you might be trying to trace a certain theme through the Bible. If that's the goal of your lesson, maybe to show how often a certain statement is made, then obviously you're going to bring up a bunch of different passages as you teach that lesson. For example, let's say you're trying to make the point that God often tells his people, do not fear. And you want to show your students how often that comes up, how many different settings in which that comes up. So, if that's the goal of your lesson, then obviously you're going to bring up a lot of different passages for that. And that would be totally fine, totally appropriate. Or sometimes the genre you're teaching from lends itself to incorporating several different verses. That would be especially true if you're teaching from Proverbs. Proverbs are just, these short statements. And when you're teaching from that book of the Bible, it really does lend itself to incorporating several different proverbs, so you can kind of round out the lesson that you're teaching on maybe some specific topic or subject there from the book of Proverbs. Okay, so if you start with a passage in mind, focus on that passage, use other passages sparingly. Now, you might start your preparation with a topic in mind instead of a specific passage. So, for example, you might be given the opportunity to speak or teach somewhere, and you think, I really want to talk about anxiety. Maybe that's something near and dear to your heart. Maybe you are just aware that a lot of people are struggling with anxiety these days. And so you think, yeah, I'd like to minister to people by teaching on this. Well, one piece of advice I would have for you would be to first narrow down your topic considerably. If you think about the topic of anxiety just in general, that's a broad topic. And if you're going to teach a lesson on that, at least a lesson that's manageable, something where you could actually get through it in a reasonable amount of time and not have it just so unfocused, you've really got to narrow that down. So, for example, you might think instead about the biblical characters who dealt with anxiety. Okay, that's a little more focused. So now you're going to draw people's attention to some different characters in the Bible who faced that, and maybe how they faced that, and why they experienced it. Or maybe you want to narrow it down to the interaction of prayer and anxiety. Okay, how can prayer help us when we're anxious? Or another example, maybe you want to focus on a biblical definition of anxiety. When we encounter a command like be anxious for nothing, it is very important for us to know if we're thinking about anxiety in the same way as the biblical authors thought about it. Are we talking about the same thing? Or are we talking about an attitude or an experience that's different than maybe what the Apostle Paul had in mind, for example, when he said, be anxious for nothing? So if you start your preparation with a topic in mind, narrow it down considerably, even before you start to look for passages that deal with that topic. Okay, so but that would be then the next step, of course. Once you've narrowed your subject down, then find some passages that deal with that subject, and then, just like I said previously, find one focus text, one key text, and camp out there, and then use other passages sparingly. Now, again, of course, there's always exceptions to that rule. One exception, for example, if you wanted to show that, hey, there were a lot of different biblical characters that dealt with anxiety. If that's the point of your lesson, like to show how common the struggle with anxiety is, then of course you're going to be bringing up a number of different passages. But again, that's fine, and that's only fitting and appropriate because that's kind of the goal of your lesson, to show how often this comes up. Now, I really have two main reasons for making this suggestion to you, suggesting that you focus on one passage and use other passages sparingly. My first reason for saying this is because the more passages you introduce in your lesson, the more potential questions you raise. Now, as we teach people from the Bible, we want to help them understand how to be good students of the Word. And good students of the Word are going to have questions pop up in their minds anytime they hear a verse of Scripture. So if you're teaching along in your lesson and maybe you read a different verse or a different passage that's not your focus passage, but you read some other passage, a good student of the Word is going to have some questions pop up in their mind. Boy, I wonder what that word means. Oh, I wonder what that other word means, or what's the context of that passage that Tim just read to us? Why was the author thinking about that? Why was it important to him? And if you bring up a lot of different passages over the course of your lesson, you're probably going to raise a lot of different questions in the minds of your students, but odds are you're not going to have time to answer all those questions. And so, more than likely, what's going to happen is you're going to send your students out of that lesson with a lot of unanswered questions in their minds. And we would like to avoid that as teachers if we possibly can. We don't want to send our students out with a lot of questions that we raised but didn't answer. Okay, now I mean they might naturally have their own questions that come up for them. That's probably going to be the case, and we might even hope that's the case because that means they're thinking about the lesson. And so they might have their own questions that pop up, but we don't want to cause questions to come up for them and then don't give them an answer to it. Okay, we want to try to avoid that if we can. And so if you can focus on one passage, it's much more likely that you can answer most or all of the questions that your students might have about that passage. The second reason why I'm giving you this advice and giving you this encouragement to focus on one passage is that if you move around to a lot of different passages, you're actually going to make your prep work a lot harder on yourself. Okay, the reason why is because if you quote a verse in the course of your lesson, or if you refer to a verse or a Bible story or something like that, you better do your homework and make sure you're quoting that verse accurately, or make sure you're telling that story accurately. Okay, if you quote a verse, you had better study at least the whole paragraph surrounding that verse, and maybe the whole chapter that verse is found in. Okay, but at a minimum, you're going to want to study. And by study, I mean you're going to want to take a careful look at least the whole paragraph that verse is found in. Okay, so think of this. If you base your lesson on one passage, then you essentially have what? One passage to study thoroughly. Yes, you'll probably study some cross references and some things like that, but your focus and your preparation is going to be on one passage. But if you try to build your lesson on, say 5 key passages that you're going to refer to, then you're going to have at least five. Well, let me get right number of fingers up there. You're going to have at least 5 paragraphs to look at closely in order to make sure that you are not taking a verse out of context. And so you have just increased your prep work considerably because you haven't selected one key passage that you're going to focus on. All right. And if you are going to refer to or quote or bring up other verses, it is imperative that you make sure that you don't take those verses out of context. There are several reasons for that. The most important being that if if I start to take passages out of context as a teacher, then the spiritual power behind my teaching is going to diminish considerably. Okay, to the extent that I take verses out of context, the spiritual power behind my teaching is going to take a nosedive. Because if I'm presenting people verses out of context, then I am no longer presenting to them the Word of God. I am presenting to them the Word of Tim. Because I'm telling them that this verse means something that it actually does not mean if I've taken it out of context. And look, sometimes the word of Tim ain't worth a hill of beans because I'm not always right about everything. And the only spiritual authority that I have as a teacher is if I can show a student that the point I'm trying to make comes from the Bible. If I can help that student see, wow, okay, here's why Tim is saying this. Oh, he's making this point, and I can see exactly how it comes out of this passage. That's the only spiritual power and authority that I have as a teacher, because I've now connected my student with the Word of God, not merely the Word of Tim. Okay? So we want to make sure that we avoid taking verses out of context in our teaching. Not just because it diminishes our spiritual power, but also because if you take a verse out of context and your audience realizes it, or if they even start to suspect that you've taken a verse out of context, you are going to lose your ethos with your audience. Remember back in session 1, we talked about that concept of ethos. That deals with you as the speaker and how you present yourself. Okay, it deals with questions like, am I a trustworthy person? Okay, can my students trust what I'm saying? And if they see that you are feeding them verses out of context, then all of a sudden your credibility is gone. It's just gone. And even if you only do that once during the course of a lesson, then everything else you say is going to be suspect in their minds, right? Because they caught you taking something out of context. And now anything that you try to say to them is just going to be thrown into doubt because of that slip up. All right, so we don't want to take verses out of context, and that's a huge risk that you run if you hop around all over the Bible as you're teaching a lesson. It's very common for beginning teachers and preachers to hop around to many different passages. One of the reasons for that is just that perhaps they've simply never been taught how to focus on one passage and squeeze everything they can out of that passage. All right, now that's going to be our focus in session 3. I'm going to introduce you to a study technique that will help you to see everything you can see in the passage in order to base a lesson right there on that one passage. But sometimes, we spot someone with potential as a teacher, and we give them opportunities to teach before they've really received any training. And so sometimes then it's just understandable that the teacher might hop around to a bunch of different passages. He also might do that just because he feels pressure to speak for a certain amount of time. If someone, especially, let's say someone's preaching for the very first time, and maybe their preacher there at the church typically goes, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, 40 minutes, something like that. Well, this new preacher is going to feel some expectation to do that, some pressure to fill up all that time. And if they don't know how to camp out in one passage, well, then what else are they going to do? But we bring up a lot of different passages just to fill that time. Okay, so that's that's what we're going to start to focus on in the remaining weeks of this seminar, giving you some idea of how to take a focused passage, see all you can see in it, and then build your lesson from there. All right. Now, as I said, you might also be working from a curriculum in order to prepare your lesson. So maybe you don't have to start from scratch. Maybe you don't have to come up with everything yourself, but maybe you are working from a curriculum. Now, if that's the case, there is still a need for you to take what that curriculum gives you and focus it down to a specific point, okay, or a specific idea that you want to develop. If you are given a curriculum to teach from, do not feel as though you are a slave to that curriculum. The curriculum is there to serve you. So as you work with it, as you present it, you should feel completely free to edit it. Maybe as you go through the lesson information that's written in the curriculum, you might find that, hey, they're bringing up a lot of different passages. I don't want to touch on all these passages. I want to be more focused than that. All right, so you should feel totally free to edit that curriculum. If you're given a curriculum, you should really think of it kind of like a set of drill bits. I brought a set of my Black & Decker drill bits here. Yes, only the finest tools at the Erickson household. My Black & Decker drill bits here. But when you buy a set of drill bits, they intentionally give you a lot more than you'll probably ever need, right? They give you drill bits for each type of material that you might work with. There's drill bits for wood, drill bits for metal, drill bits for masonry. And those are all different. So they don't give you just, the drill bits for wood, unless you buy a very specific set of drill bits, but they give you a wide range of them. And not only that, but they give you all these different sizes of drill bits, right? So many different sizes that you'll probably never use all of them. I can look at these here and, I can see some that are still completely clean because I've never had to use them. Depending on the jobs, I've only had to use a few of these. But, the manufacturer gives me more drill bits than I will probably ever need. Because for one thing, they don't want to leave me hanging when I'm doing a job. They don't want to leave me with just a choice between large and small when, I actually need like a medium-sized drill bit. They want to give me all these different sizes, all these different measurements, so I have exactly what I need when I need it. All right. Now, that's kind of the way that you need to think about a curriculum that you are given to use. In the amount of information that the publisher gives you, they are aiming for a range that's like from plenty to too much. Okay? At a minimum, they want to give you plenty of information. At a maximum, they want to give you too much information to work with. And there are several reasons for that. For one thing, the publisher is trying to serve you. That's kind of their role, right? They're trying to serve you by helping you in your lesson preparation. So they want to make sure that they serve you well and leave you fully equipped and prepared for tailoring and creating your own lesson out of the information that they give you. For another thing, the publisher is trying to cover their bottom line a little bit. All right, they don't want to gain a reputation as the publisher that doesn't give you enough information in the curriculum. They don't want to get all of these, online reviews that say, there wasn't enough information here to work with, or, every week in Sunday school, they left me hanging for the last 10 minutes because we ran out of information. No publisher wants to do that to you, and they don't want to gain that reputation. They're a lot like restaurants in that regard, right? No restaurant wants to become known for giving you portion sizes that are too small, right? That's why we go to a restaurant these days and we get like almost an ungodly amount of food served up to us, right? Because if anything, they want us to be able to take some food home. They don't want us to leave there thinking, man, I didn't get enough. And so there's a very similar thing going on in the publishing world. They want to give you plenty at a minimum to almost too much. Okay. And then a third thing that's going on here is that publishers understand that they're writing for a generic audience. Yes, they might be writing for fourth and fifth grade students in particular, and so it might be that narrow at least. But they're not writing for the fourth and fifth grade students at Morningside Community Church in Montezuma, Kansas, because they don't know our fourth and fifth grade students. So they are writing for fourth and fifth grade students generically. They're writing for like all fourth and fifth grade students in the United States. Okay, so they're writing for a general audience. And what they're counting on then is that you will take their curriculum and tailor it to your specific students. So that's what you want to do. Rather than just open the curriculum and feel like you have to get through everything that's there, you want to focus that information as well. In much a similar way as you would if you were preparing your own lesson from scratch. Okay, if you're preparing a lesson from scratch, you want to make it focused. Don't let it get so broad or so just unwieldy that it's all out of focus. And it's exactly the same principle if you start with a curriculum. Don't feel enslaved to that curriculum. Instead, use that curriculum as a tool and narrow it down if you need to. Don't feel like you have to bring up every Bible verse that they might include in the lesson section. Don't feel like you have to use every discussion question that they provide or anything like that. Use that curriculum as your tool to serve your students as you prepare your lesson for them. because ultimately that's what it should be. You shouldn't be aiming to simply regurgitate whatever was mentioned there in the curriculum. Even if you use a curriculum, you should be thinking of this as, I am presenting my lesson to these students. I'm just using this curriculum as a tool to help me uh, present to these students. Okay? I hope that makes sense there. And as I already said a little bit, in our next session, session 3, I'm going to be introducing you to a Bible study technique. It's called phrasing. That's going to help you understand a passage thoroughly so that you then have a better grasp of how to stay right there in one passage and teach a full, well-rounded lesson from just that one passage. Okay, so I want to give you some help to actually do what I've told you to do in this lesson tonight. Okay, I don't want to leave you hanging without giving you some explanation of how to actually pull off what I am starting to encourage you to do. All right. Well, thanks for being here again. Thanks for tuning in again. If you're watching this lesson some other time, and we will see you again later.